Today we are putting two of the absolute biggest names in cloud computing into the ring for a real head-to-head comparison. Amazon's API Gateway and Microsoft's Azure API Management. Look, if you're building modern applications, you have to manage your APIs. So, the big question is, which one of these giants is the right choice for you? Well, let's dive in and find out.
Okay, first things first. Let's get on the same page. What are we really talking about here? Well, according to Gartner, API management is basically the software that handles everything to do with your APIs. You can think of it like an air traffic control tower for all the digital conversations happening between your apps. It's truly the foundation of modern business.
Now, inside that control tower, there's one piece of equipment that's probably the most critical of them all, the API Gateway. This thing is the front door for every single API request. It handles security, traffic, routing, it's the bouncer, the traffic cop, and the concierge all rolled into one. And both services we're looking at today are, at their heart, really sophisticated API gateways.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll meet our contenders. Then, we'll put their core features head-to-head. After that, we'll dig into security and scalability, look at the price of all that power, and finally, deliver the verdict to help you make your choice.
All right, let's get to it and properly introduce our two challengers. We're talking about two of the largest, most powerful cloud providers on the entire planet, and each one has its own unique take on managing APIs.
Now, what I find really interesting is where the big industry analysts over at Gartner place them. See, in the 2024 Magic Quadrant for API management, both Microsoft and AWS are right there in the Challengers Quadrant. So what does that mean? It tells us they're absolutely major players, but they're still challenging the established leaders when it comes to having a complete long-term vision for the market.
And when you look at the market mindshare data from PeerSpot, you can see just how close this race is. I mean, Microsoft has a tiny edge at 14.7%, but AWS is breathing down their neck at 12.1%. So this isn't some David versus Goliath story. No way. This is a true clash of the titans. Okay, so where do they really differ? Let's pop the hood and compare not just their features, but their entire philosophies on how this should be done.
This right here, this is probably the most important distinction between the two. AWS API Gateway is built from the ground up with a serverless-first mindset. It's made to work perfectly with services like AWS Lambda, and it runs on a pure pay-as-you-go model. Azure, on the other hand, comes at it from a more classic enterprise angle. It's this fully managed all-in-one suite of tools, and it's woven deep into the whole Azure ecosystem.
And this table really lays out how those different philosophies play out in the real world. For observability, you've got CloudWatch versus Azure Monitor. For network isolation, it's VPC endpoints versus virtual networks. But pay close attention to the bottom three rows. With AWS, if you need a developer portal, you're looking at an open source add-on. With Azure, it's already built right in. Monetization, AWS makes you use third-party tools, while Azure has it ready to go. And for hybrid cloud, Azure has a really clear advantage with its self-hosted gateways.
This quote from a user really drives that point home. If you're looking at your APIs as actual products, things that can make you money, then Azure's built-in monetization is a huge feature that AWS just doesn't give you out of the box.
Okay, let's talk about two things that are absolutely critical for any developer or architect: keeping your APIs safe and making sure they can handle the heat when traffic spikes. Both of these platforms offer absolutely rock-solid security, but they do it by tapping into their own ecosystems. So AWS ties into its identity and access management, that's IAM, plus Cognito for user logins, and its web application firewall, or WAF, for protection. Azure, meanwhile, leans on its powerhouse Azure Active Directory for identity, and it has great support for standards like OAuth 2.0 and handy built-in policies for things like IP filtering.
And scalability is another place where you can really see their different philosophies in action. AWS API Gateway is designed to scale automatically, right alongside services like Lambda. This makes it perfect for those modern, event-driven apps where your traffic might be super spiky and unpredictable. Azure, on the other hand, is built like an enterprise beast. It's made for that constant, high-volume traffic that you can plan for, and it has these really robust, built-in scaling options.
But hey, don't ever mistake the AWS model for being less powerful. As this user points out, it is incredibly stable, and it can handle massive scale. We're talking millions of users without a problem. So the key isn't really about which one is bigger, but which model of scaling is the right fit for your app's traffic.
All right, let's talk about the bottom line.
For so many projects, the decision really comes down to one thing: cost. So how do these two stack up when it's time to actually pay the bill?
And surprise, surprise, it comes right back to their core philosophies. AWS is pure pay-per-use. You just pay for what you consume, per million API calls, plus data transfer. This is fantastic for startups or apps with really variable traffic. Azure uses a tiered model. You pay a fixed cost every month for an instance, which makes your bill really predictable. That's way better for those big enterprise apps with constant, heavy workloads.
So to put a real number on it, the cost for AWS API Gateway is roughly $3.50 per million calls for its standard REST APIs. It's simple, it's direct, it's pay-as-you-go. But here's the twist. Azure also has a consumption tier, and its price is, you guessed it, also around $3.50 per million calls. So the real takeaway here isn't just about the per-call price. The bigger decision is whether you want the predictability of a fixed monthly bill or the flexibility of a pure pay-as-you-go model. All right, we've looked at their philosophies, their features, security, scalability, and of course, the price. Now it's time to put it all together. It's decision time. So after all of that, what's the final verdict? Which one of these platforms should you pick for your next big project? Well, the real answer, as it almost always is it really depends on what you need. Here's the breakdown. You should go with Amazon API Gateway if you are all in on the AWS ecosystem. If your whole world is serverless and event-driven, if your traffic is all over the place, and if you just love the idea of only paying for exactly what you use, then AWS is pretty much tailor-made for you. On the other hand, you should definitely choose Azure API Management if your organization lives and breathes Microsoft. If you absolutely need strong support for hybrid or even multi-cloud setups, if you've got high-volume APIs and want those predictable costs, and if you need those enterprise-grade features like a developer portal and monetization right out of the box, well then Azure is the clear winner for you.
And all of this brings us to one final big-picture thought. This whole choice between AWS and Azure, it really highlights a bigger question in the tech world today. Is the future going to be dominated by these gateways that are deeply, deeply tied to a single cloud ecosystem? Or, as more companies start working across multiple clouds, are we going to see more flexible, cloud-agnostic platforms become the new gold standard? Now, that is something for all of us to watch. Thanks for joining us.